here's another something worth considering, and I don't know how important it is, but it might be really important. It depends on how important. This is something that Carl Jung said, so it depends on how important Jung is. Now, Freud established the field of psychoanalysis, and with it, investigation, I would say, rigorous investigation into the contents of the unconscious. Now, modern psychologists and psychiatrists like to, what would you say, denigrate Freud. But, and I think there's a reason for that. I think that Freud's fundamental insights were so profound and so valuable that they got immediately absorbed into our culture. And now they seem self-evident, and so that all that's left of Freud is his errors. You know, because we believe everything else. We believe all the profound things he discovered. We just take them for granted, and so we don't believe the things that he said that weren't quite on the money. And that's all we credit him with now. But he was certainly the first person who brought up the idea of the unconscious in a rigorous manner. And he was the first person to do a rigorous examination of dreams. Because the interpretation of dreams is a great book. It's well worth reading. And he was the first person to note that people were, in some sense, inhabited by sub-personalities that had a certain degree of autonomy and independent life. Brilliant observation. The cognitive psychologists haven't caught up with that at all yet. Jung was profoundly affected by Freud. Jung was profoundly affected by Nietzsche and by Freud. Those were his two main intellectual influences. I don't think one more than the other. He split with Freud on the religious issue. That was what caused the disruption in their relationship. And I think it's an extremely interesting historical occurrence. It might be of profound significance. Freud believed that the fundamental myth of the human being was the Oedipal myth. And the Oedipal myth, from a broader perspective, is a failed hero story. So the Oedipal myth is the myth of a man who develops, who grows up, but then accidentally becomes too close to his mother, sleeps with her. He doesn't know who she is, and as a consequence blinds himself. And there's a warning about human development gone wrong in that story. And I think that Freud put his finger on it extraordinarily well, because human beings have a very long period of dependency. And one of the things that you do see in clinical practice is that many people's problems are associated with their inability to break free of their family. Like they're consumed by the family drama, right? They can't get beyond what happened to them in their family. They're stuck in the past. And that's equivalent, symbolically speaking, you might say, to the idea of being too close to your mother, of the boundaries being improperly specified. And that happens far more often than anyone would like to think. As I said, Freud thought it was a universal. But Jung, see, he had a different idea, and his idea was that it wasn't the failed hero story that was the universal human myth. It was the successful hero story. And that's a big difference. Like, it's seriously a big difference. Because the successful hero story is, you remember in Sleeping Beauty, you may remember this in the Disney movie, the evil queen traps the prince in a dungeon, and she's not going to let him out till he's old, right? And so there's this comical scene where she's down in the dungeon, he's all in chains, and she's laughing at him, telling him what his future is going to be like. She's quite evil. And, you know, she paints this wonderful picture of him being freed in like 80 years and hobbling out of the castle on his horse that's so old he can barely stand up, and him with gray hair. And you know, and she recites this story of his eventual triumphant departure from the castle as an old and decrepit man, and she has a great laugh about it. And it's nice, you know, it's a real punchy story. It's really something wonderful for children, that story. And he gets free of the shackles. And the things that free him are three little female fairies. So it's the positive aspect of the feminine that frees him from the dungeon. So it's very interesting and very accurate from a psychological perspective. It's the negative element of the feminine that encapsulates him in the dungeon, and it's the positive element of the feminine that frees him. And then he has the queen, the evil queen, is not very happy when he escapes. You may remember this. She stands on top of her castle tower and starts to spin off cosmic sparks. I mean, she's quite the creature, enveloped in flame, and then she turns into a dragon. And then the prince has to fight with her in order to make contact with Sleeping Beauty and awaken her from her comatose existence, as her unconscious existence. And well, it's a brilliant representation of a successful hero myth. He doesn't end up staying in an unholy relationship with his mother, let's say. He escapes and then conquers the worst thing that can be imagined and is ennobled by that. And that, as a consequence, he's able to wake the slumbering feminine from its coma. And that's a Jungian story. And that's the story that he juxtaposed against Freud. See, Freud thought of religious phenomena as part of an occult tide that would drown rationality. That's why Freud was so vehemently anti-religious. And Jung thought, no, it's not the case. You're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's something profound and central to the hero myth. And Jungian clinical work is essentially the awakening of the hero myth in the analysand, in the client or in the patient, to conceptualize yourself as that which can confront chaos and triumph, and that's associated with an ennobling of consciousness and the establishment of proper positive relationships between male and female. And you know, I'm a skeptical person. I'm a very, very skeptical person, and I've tried with every trick I have to put a lever underneath Jung's story and lift it up and disrupt it, and I can't do it. I think he was right and that Freud was wrong. I mean, I have great respect for Freud. I think he got the problem diagnosed very, very nicely. And in my clinical work, I see the phenomena that Freud described emerge continually, constantly. The best, if you're interested in that, there's a documentary you should watch. I may have mentioned it before. I think it's the best documentary ever made. It's certainly the best one I've ever seen. It's called Crumb. And it's about an underground cartoonist, Robert Crumb, who was part of the hippie movement, although he hated hippies. He was part of the hippie movement in the 60s in San Francisco and started the entire underground comic culture that manifested itself eventually in graphic novels. He was quite a significant figure from the perspective of popular art, and a very, very intelligent man. And also, I would say, a hero, although a very bent and depraved and warped one. Someone very acutely aware of his own shadow. And the documentary outlines his attempts to escape from his absolutely dreadful mother, and the failure of his two brothers to do the same thing, one of whom ended up as a street beggar in San Francisco, and the other who drank furniture polish and died 6 months after the documentary was produced. It's an unbelievably shocking documentary. It's the only piece of film that I've ever seen that captures Freudian pathology. I've never seen anything, because you can't see it generally unless you're in a clinical situation, unless you know the details of someone's lives, the personal, intimate details. You cannot communicate it. But the documentarist who made the film, who's Robert Zwigoff, if I remember correctly, was a friend of the Crumbs. And so he got access in a way that no one else would have. And they were also very forthright and forthcoming about their situation in general. I would highly recommend that. It's a real punch. If you want to know how a rapist thinks, like if you actually want to know, because maybe you don't want to know. In fact, you probably don't want to know. Right, because do you really want to know that? Because to understand that means to put yourself in that position and to understand it. If you really want to know how a serial sexual predator thinks and why, if you watch Crumb and you pay attention, you'll know. And that's only a tiny bit of what the film has to offer. It's really quite remarkable. Anyways, Jung split with Freud on the issue of the Oedipal story as the fundamental myth of humankind, and on the issue of the validity of the religious viewpoint. And Jung came down heavily on the side of the validity of the religious viewpoint. And he established that in a book called Symbols of Transformation, which was written in 1914. And that's the book that produced the permanent split with Freud. And that book, I would say that book's actually been written 3 times. it was written as symbols of, 4 times, written as symbols of transformation, which Jung extensively revised when he was old. And then it was rewritten, in a sense, by a student of Jung's called Erich Neumann, who's also someone I would really recommend. Erich Neumann, I think, is Jung's greatest student. And he wrote 2 books. He wrote one called The Origins and History of Consciousness, which is a description of the development of consciousness out of unconsciousness, using the hero myth as an interpretive skeleton. So Neumann viewed the hero myth as the dramatized story of the emergence of human consciousness out of the surrounding unconsciousness in which it was embedded. The struggle for consciousness, the struggle of consciousness upward towards the light, like a lotus flower struggles up through the muck and the water to lay itself on the surface of the water and bloom and reveal the Buddha, which is, of course, what the lotus flower does from a symbolic perspective. And for Neumann, the hero's story was the story of the successful development of consciousness. And The Origins of Consciousness, The Origins and History of Consciousness is a great book. Interestingly, Camille Paglia read The Origins and History of Consciousness. She's one of the few mainstream intellectuals that I've ever encountered who read that and commented on it. And she believed that it would be sufficient antidote to postmodern denigration of literature. She thought it was that powerful a work, and I believe that. I think it's a remarkable book. Carl Jung wrote the foreword to that book, and he said in the foreword that it was the book that he wished he would have written. So it's sort of like Jung, he wrote, I don't remember how many volumes, dozens of very thick, difficult volumes. It was like Neumann was able to distill those into a single volume statement. And so I would also say, if you're interested in Jung, the best book to read is The Origins and History of Consciousness. It's the best intro into the Jungian world. So Jung's very difficult to understand. It requires a real shift of perspective in order to understand what he's talking about. And Neumann wrote another book called The Great Mother, which is a little bit more specialized in some sense, but it's also extremely interesting because it fleshes out the archetype of chaos and its representation as feminine. It's a brilliant book as well, and highly worth reading, both those books. Anyways, Jung was a very strange person and a visionary, and so that's kept him outside of the academic realm almost entirely. I mean, I was constantly warned as an undergraduate and then a graduate student and then a professor against ever talking about Jung in any way whatsoever. When I went on the job market, when I was at McGill, when I had graduated from McGill, I had done my scientific research on alcoholism, and I had a fairly lengthy publication record that was pure empirical research and really neurophysiological research into the pharmacology of alcoholism. And I had established a reasonably solid dossier of publications, but at the same time I was writing this book that became Maps of Meaning, and so I'd split my time in graduate student school between these two endeavors, one very specifically neurological and pharmacological and really biologically based, and the other very abstract, religious, symbolic, psychoanalytic, the complete opposite. But I could see that the two things overlapped really nicely, and there was a number of scientists at the time that were also drawing the same conclusions, the same relationship between the biology and the psychoanalysis. Jaak Panksepp, who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which is a great classic, is one of those people who saw the relationship between the neurobiology of emotion and motivation and the psychoanalytic insights. Never became a mainstream view, but I think it's too complex. I think that bridging the gap between the biology and the symbolic is too much for people, generally speaking. You know, it was certainly virtually too much for me because I got quite ill when I was a graduate student, I think, for a variety of reasons. I also would go out and party 3 nights a week, and so that probably had something to do with it. But working on those two things simultaneously was also rather exhausting. Now, Jung was a tremendously insightful clinician, and he was a strange person, introverted visionary, high in introversion, very, 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 very high in openness, like off the charts. And also, God only knows what his IQ was. I mean, every time I read Jung, it's like reading Nietzsche. It's terrifying because, you know, he's so damn smart that he can think up answers to questions that you don't even, it's not like you don't understand the answers. It's that you never conceptualized the damn questions. It's really something to read someone like that, right, who says, well, here's a mystery, and you think, wow, I never thought of that as a mystery, and here's the solution. It's like, okay, that's something, you know. And he could read Greek, and he read a very large variety of ancient languages and was very familiar with the entire corpus of astrological thought and of alchemical thought and of classic literature and biblical stories. And I mean, educated in a way that no one is educated now. And so he's a very daunting person to encounter and terrifying, absolutely terrifying. His book, Ion, which is the second volume of volume 9, which is the archetypes of the collective unconscious. That damn book is just absolutely terrifying because Jung, he's one of these visionaries who can see way underneath the social structures and look at patterns that are developing across, in Jung's case, across thousands of years and lays them out. And so that's really something to encounter. Ion is a terrifying book. Anyways, one question might be, well, because I read Jung and I think, how the hell did he know these things? How could he figure these things out? I can't understand how he could possibly know these things. Well, here's a partial answer. Jung was a visionary, and so what that means, as far as I can tell, and we could do a little quick survey here. How many of you think in words? Put up your hands. Do you think in words? Okay, so it looks like. What about pictures? How many of you think in pictures? Okay, so that's interesting. How many of you think, that's about half and half, by the way, probably a fewer on the word side. How many of you think in pictures and words? Okay, and so, all right, so it was roughly a third in each category, but that's also something that I really haven't encountered any research on from the neuropsychological perspective. It's like, well, do you think in pictures or do you think in words? And is that actually a reliable distinction? I think in words most of the time, but I can think in pictures. Like if I'm trying to build something, I can think in pictures very almost instantaneously, but it isn't my natural mode of thinking. I'm hyperverbal, and so my natural mode of thinking is to think everything through in words. But I know my wife isn't like that. She thinks in images and then has to translate them into words. And so, anyways, Jung was very literate, and he could really think in words, but he could really think in images. Also, talking to my wife quite extensively, like the intensity of her visualization vastly exceeds mine. So for example, if I close my eyes and I try to imagine the crowd in front of me, it's pretty low resolution and vague and not brilliantly colored and vivid. You know, it's like I'm seeing through a glass darkly, let's say. I can't bring images to mind with spectacular clarity, but my wife is very good at that, and Jung seemed to be absolutely a genius at that kind of thinking. And he had a lot of visionaries in his family history as well. So I don't know to what degree there's a hereditary component of that, and I don't know to what degree that's actually like a neurological specialization. I presume it would be associated with the trait openness distinguishes itself, differentiates itself into interest in ideas and interest in aesthetics. And my suspicion is that the people who are more interested in aesthetics are the visionary types, the ones that think in images. Anyways, Jung could really think in images, and he could imagine beings. And I had a client once who was a lucid dreamer. And how many of you have had a lucid dream? So you know you're dreaming while you're, okay, many. That phenomena wasn't really even identified as a phenomena until the end of the 19th century. There was a book written about it that Freud tried to get his hands on but couldn't, because it was a very rare book. And then there was a researcher about 30 years ago who started to study lucid dreams. But anyways, I had a client who was a lucid dreamer, and one of the things she could do was ask her dream characters what information they were trying to convey, and they would tell her. So that was very interesting. And one of the consequences of that was, and I don't have this story completely right in my memory, but it's close enough. She was afraid of a very large number of things. And in her dream, I think it was a gypsy, standing by a wagon, told her that if she was going to be successful in university, that she would have to visit a slaughterhouse. And that was something that was way beyond her capacity to tolerate. She was a vegetarian. She couldn't stand the sight of raw meat even. And she was very oppressed and depressed and anxious because of the slaughterhouse nature of existence. And so her dream focused on that. And one of the consequences of that, because the slaughterhouse was out of the question as a clinical intervention, I took her to an embalming, right? Because I asked her what might be equivalent to that, and so she suggested that. And exposure therapy is a hallmark of clinical psychology, right? One of the things you do with people as a clinician is you find out what they're afraid of, and you gradually and voluntarily expose them to that, and that cures them. And that's associated with the hero myth, right? It's exactly the same thing. It's like there's a dragon, it's stopping you, because there's lots of dragons, most of them aren't stopping you. You can ignore them. You don't have to just go, slash away at randomly. You're not supposed to be fighting dragons that aren't in your way. But if they are in your way, you can't ignore them, and then you decompose them into sub-dragons, and you have people, take them on. And as they take them on, they dispense with the dragon, and they gain the power of the dragon. It's like a video game. Actually, a video game is like that. That's why people like the video games. Well, that's right? There's a reason that you absorb power when you overcome things when you play a video game. It's not like that's intrinsic to the video game structure. That's an archetypal idea. Anyways, we went and saw an embalming, which was a very interesting experience and quite useful for her, because she knew what she could tolerate after that. And it was a hell of a lot more than she thought she could tolerate. And so that's very useful to know. Back to Jung. He's a visionary thinker. Now, my client, I said, she could lucid dream, and she could ask her dream characters what they wanted and what they were trying to communicate to her. So that was pretty interesting. That happened spontaneously, had nothing to do with me. I mean, I'm interested in dreams, and many of my clients are great dreamers, especially the creative ones, because I think it's a hallmark of creativity to have vivid dreams and to be able to remember them. But that was a faculty that was natural to her. Jung had this other client at one point, and she had a variety of fears, and she had this dream that she told me, and she was walking down a beach, and on the side of the beach, up a small dune, there was this old man with a snake, a big python, and there's a crowd around him, and she was walking by the snake handler and the snake and the crowd, and she didn't want to have anything to do with him. He was sort of showing people this snake, and she told me that dream, and I thought, well, you probably need to go see that snake. And so I relaxed her. It's a quasi-hypnotic technique, and it's very straightforward. Hypnosis is generally nothing but pronounced relaxation, although you have to be susceptible to hypnosis to actually fall into a hypnotic trance as a consequence of being relaxed. I just relaxed her. I had her breathe deeply and pay attention to different parts of her body and just relax her muscles one by one, essentially, so that she could concentrate. And then I told her we'd play with the dream a little bit. It's a Jungian technique. I said, well, so call the dream image to mind, which she could do quite well. I said, okay, so let's explore it. It's like pretend play. If you're a kid and you're pretend playing, you don't exactly direct the game, right? You play the game. So it's partly your direction, obviously, because you're the player, but the thing also happens spontaneously of its own accord. And you could think about that as a dialogue between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind in some sense. It's a developmental dialogue. It's not a fun game if you just direct it. It's only a fun game if you're inviting and something is welling up as a consequence. It's the same thing that happens when you're engaged in some kind of artistic or literary production. If it's all top down, if you're forcing it, then it's propaganda, it's empty. What you want to sort of is put yourself in a receptive state of mind, in an imaginative state of mind, and it's sort of half you and half nature itself manifesting itself in your creative imagination. And that was the sort of state that we were striving for. And I asked her when she was relaxed, I said, well, what do you think about the snake handler? And she said, well, he's probably a charlatan and He's just there trying to impress the crowd and to show off. And she was afraid to go up there because she thought people would push her towards the snake and she'd have to touch it. And so there was a fear of the crowd issue going on there too. And I said, well, just look, go up there, but do it under these conditions. Is that, if people get pushy, what are you going to tell them? And so we figured out something. He said, look, you just tell them that, you want to look at the snake at your own pace and that you don't need any encouragement or help, and it would be good if you were just left alone. So that enabled her to defend herself. So she was afraid that the crowd would push her to do something that she didn't want to do. That was part of the theme of the dream. So anyway, she eventually climbed the dune in her imagination and went into the crowd, and the crowd turned out to be quite welcoming and not hostile and not pushy, which isn't what you'd expect, right? Because you'd think the crowd would have reacted in accordance with her fears, since it was her fantasy. But that's the thing about fantasies, they have this autonomous quality. But the crowd was welcoming and not hostile, and it turned out that the snake handler wasn't a charlatan. He was just an old guy who had this snake, and he was out there just showing it to people because he thought it was a cool thing, and that maybe it was good for people to come and look at a snake. And so she got close enough to the snake to touch it. And so I'm telling you that because I want you to understand a bit more about what Jung was trying to do. And so he wrote these books, notebooks that haven't been published yet, called the Black Books. And the Black Books are the documentation of his experiments with his imagination. And what he would do is daydream, like a child daydreams. He regained that faculty, although I think with Jung it was a faculty that had never really disappeared. And he had figures of imagination that came to him that he could speak with. And he spoke with these figures of imagination and documented that over a very long period of time. And that was eventually distilled into a book called The Red Book, which was published about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a book that Jung regarded as the central source from which all his inspiration emerged. It was sort of, the way it looks to me is that we embody a lot of information in our action, right? And our action has developed as a consequence of imitating other people. And not only the people around us, but of course the people around us imitated the people who came before them, and those people imitated the people who came before them, and so on, so far back that it's as far back as you can go. And so you embody these patterns of behavior that are extremely informative, that you don't understand, that are a consequence of collective imitation across the centuries. And so then those patterns can become manifest as figures of the imagination. And those figures of imagination are the distillations of patterns of behavior. And so as the distillations of patterns of behavior, they have content. And it's not you, that content. You could even think about it as content that's evolved, although it's culturally transmitted. It's content that's evolved. And so these figures of the imagination can reveal the structure of reality to you. And that's what happened with Jung, and that's what he described in the Red Book, and that was what permeated his psychology, a psychology that was based on the presupposition that the fundamental archetypal structures of religious belief were not pathological, not deceitful, not protective in some delusional sense against the fear of death, but quite the contrary. The very stories that enabled us to move forward as confident human beings in the face of chaos itself. And it's conceivable, I think perhaps probable, that nothing more important conceptually happened in the 20th century than that. Because it was the first time post-Enlightenment that a rapprochement between the intellect and the underlying religious archetypal substructure occurred. You have in the capacious intellect of Jung, and the same thing happened to some degree with Piaget, the religious domain and the factual domain were brought back together. And the fact of Jung's enduring and increasing popularity and influence, I would say, is a direct consequence of that. Now, some of his work was spun off into the New Age, and the New Age is a very optimistic and naive movement, It's predicated on the idea that you can do nothing, say, but follow your bliss, and that will take you ever higher to enlightenment, and that's not the Jungian idea at all. The Jungian idea is that what you most need will be found where you least want to look. So there's this story, King Arthur, there's this story of King Arthur. They're all in a round table, right? King Arthur and his knights, they're all equals. They're all superordinate, but they're all equals. And they go off to look for the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail is the container of the redemptive substance, whatever that is. It might be the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper, or it might be a chalice that was used to capture his blood on the cross, right, when he was pierced by a sword. The stories differ, but that's the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is lost. That's the redemptive substance, and the knights of King Arthur go off to search for the Holy Grail, but they don't know where to look. So where do you look when you don't know where to look for something you need desperately but have lost? Well, each of the knights goes into the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's Jungian psychoanalysis in a nutshell. It's like that which you fear and avoid, that which you hold in contempt, that which disgusts you and that you avoid. That's the gateway to what you need to know. There's nothing New Age about that. That's for sure. Now, Jung, when he started this endeavor, he started with this. This is part of the notebooks from the Black Book. He said, he wrote, my soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak. I call you. Are you there? I've returned. I'm here again. I've shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I've come to you. I am with you. After long years of long wandering, I have come to you again. For the Jungians, the hero's journey is a journey within. And I think that that's probably the bias of introverts, to believe that the hero's journey is only an inward journey. I think that it can be an outward journey too, because I don't think it matters where you confront the unknown, whether it's within or without. What matters is whether or not you confront the unknown. That's what matters. But he found that what he had ignored was an undiscovered part of himself. So that might be something that was equivalent to Huxley's notion that there's tremendous potential breadth in the realm of human conscious experience. And Huxley was influenced to some degree by Jung. Now, Jung knew of Huxley's experiments and had commented on psychedelic use. And he said something like, beware of wisdom you did not earn. And Jung was very good at stating things very profoundly, very simply. And that's a very intelligent piece of advice. Beware of wisdom you did not earn. He wrote a paper, if you're interested in this sort of thing. He wrote a paper called The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, which is an absolute masterwork, but completely incomprehensible unless you know what it's about. And what it's about is the danger of what he called ego inflation. And so one of the things that can happen as a consequence of a revelatory experience is that the division between the individual ego and what would you call it? It's so hard to come up with a word that isn't somehow naive or cliched. To erase the relationship, the boundary between the specific consciousness of the ego and the more generalized consciousness, and more generalized consciousness as such, is a dangerous thing to do, because you can start to equate yourself, your specific self, with that more generalized consciousness as such. And Jung thought about that as something akin to a psychotic inflation. And the paper, Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, is a document that tells you how to avoid that if you're playing in this kind of realm. And one of the injunctions is to keep your feet on the ground. He thought that was partly what happened to Nietzsche, was that Nietzsche wasn't grounded enough in life. He wasn't grounded enough in day-to-day rituals and routines and the mundane. Now, you can debate whether or not that's the case, and whether or not that's a reasonable argument, but that was still what Jung believed. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? I'll finish with this. From December 1913 onward, Jung carried on in the same procedure, deliberately evoking a fantasy in a waking state and then entering into it as a drama. These fantasies may be understood as a type of dramatized thinking in pictorial form. In retrospect, he recalled that his scientific question was to see what took place when he switched off consciousness. The example of dreams indicated the existence of background activity, and he wanted to give this a possibility of emerging, just as one does when taking mescaline. These journals are Jung's contemporaneous clinical ledger to his most difficult experiment, or what he later describes as a voyage of discovery to the other pole of the world. Jung believed that we were dreaming all the time, but that during waking life, the pressure of external images was such that the unconscious fantasy imagery was, or that the fantasy imagery was of insufficient magnitude to be conscious, but that we were always situated in a dream in relationship to the world. So